Did it again. Oh well. Recording now. Always miss the first slide. Anyways, I just wanted to say at the top here that obviously I didn't want to just copy the entire text verbatim into a PowerPoint slide, into a PowerPoint. That wouldn't make any sense. So I just kind of picked quotes that I think give decent summaries of the contents of each chapter. Obviously, with a summary, I'm always going to leave bits and pieces out. A lot of good bits and pieces too. So this is why reading the text in its entirety is obviously a good thing to do. And the summary is
Well,
mostly just so we can kind of work through some of the big points here. So just wanted to make that note. All right. So Engels, he says, the state is a public power, and it's necessary because there isn't a self-acting armed organization of the population because the population is split into classes, which again we just mentioned have irreconcilable differences and diametrically opposed interests. So you basically this is leading to basically saying one class is going to be in control of this public power, and shocker, it's the class that owns everything and controls basically everything. And what exactly the state consists of in a very material sense is the special bodies of armed men. So this is prisons, the police, army, all the branches of the military, etc. These are basically coercive forces. So, like we talked about a little bit last week about, the classic, like, why would anyone work? Well, you can also say, why would anyone work in capitalism? Well, because there's this implicit threat of violence from the state if you do not comply with basically increasing
everything.
capital, essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And for the point of why would anyone work, I would go and take a look on the modding community where they really use a lot of time, a lot of effort to make a product that they don't profit on just because they would like to do it anyway. There is something that is called passion, and there is something that is called empathy, and both of these things are unavailable in a capitalist system.
Yep, that's totally true. And that's not, I wasn't trying to make that implication. That's
No,
not a
no,
reason you could
I'm
work.
just,
But we're addressing the liberal in the walls. I understand where you're
yeah.
coming from.
I can't not address the liberal and the
Yeah,
left.
I'm really glad that they came up with that analogy on the pod because it's so true.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us can probably relate. Um, all right, let's keep going here. I'm gonna try and hustle through the slides a little bit, but obviously, if you have questions or comments, just jump in. All right, so this is an interesting paragraph, right? So Lenin is saying that a democratic republic is actually indeed the best possible political shell for capitalism, and that once it's in this shell, it is able to really batten down the hatches and become very, very difficult to shake within the system. That's an important note here. Is this is what he means by any change in persons, institutions, or parties within the bourgeois democratic republic are not going to change the fact that basically the capitalism part of the equation. So again, this is really an interesting point that I think is empirically basically widely proven. I think, and the evidence is overwhelming. I think that this is a pretty accurate observation on Lenin's part, right? So
For the
electing
liberal and all, if you don't see that, just fucking look at history, please.
exactly, yeah. And this is this is one of those arguments where this is not something
Where
that
you can
he's like
go outside.
deducing. Yeah, this isn't not
It's
something
one of
he's
the
like
arguments that you can go outside and look, and you would find the end of the argument.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. This is not an argument where it's like a logical deduction. It's just an observation, and it's a hypothesis, right? Let's call it that. And if we're scientific socialists, so we should do a little science. This is a hypothesis. If we want to judge a hypothesis, we need to look at the evidence. I think in this case, the evidence is pretty massively overwhelming. And there's been quite a few like elections that elect fairly far left social democrats, even people who call themselves socialists and so forth, and that still really never does the trick, does it? Unfortunately, I mean, you also have the imperialistic dimension of it all, with the U.S. is going to come in and whack anyone who's left of Dick Cheney, basically. So that you got that element, which is a big issue, but also the
You're left of Hitler. I must kill you.
yeah, pretty much. Yeah. But again, I would say, in this, if you're asking yourself like, oh, why is this? Well, it's more, like I said, it's an observation that was true in Lenin's time. It's true in our time, and it's true because it's incredibly well supported by evidence. That's essentially what it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the almost entire Anglosphere, you have the Democrats and Republicans in America, the duopoly. Then in Australia, you have the Liberals and Labor and the Liberals. England, Britain, you have the Labor and the Tories. Then you have the Liberals and whoever in Canada. It's just like a duopoly where they switch whoever's in the driving seat every few years. Then they keep continuing the same thing over and over.
It's also worth looking at them from the lens of who backs them in the end and whose interests do they universally end up serving. And it's still always the owner class, capital itself.
And the thing is, when you look at them, they both have these same supporters, because in the end of the day, there is no big difference. They, in a sense that I look at it from a third world perspective, I see them as one party that is split on some issues, no more and no less.
I think there's a really nice quote from someone, I don't remember who it's from. Someone's gonna have to look it up for me and put it in the chat. But it's like, one of my favorites where it's America is like a single party dictatorship, but in classic American extravagance, they have two of. So.
Yeah, I think that might have been a Carlin quote.
Great quote.
It sounds like Carlin.
That's I made that quote. You're wrong.
I don't think it's from Carlin either, but
I'll take a look.
Like the leader of Tanzania or something.
It was from an African revolutionary from during the Cold War.
I think that's.
Oh wait, taking a look. With typical American extravagance, they have two of them from Julius Nyerere, some Tanzanian politician.
Tanzania. Okay, that's what I thought. Cool. My memory served me well. But yeah, this is a classic argument from. All right, another banger from Engels. This is, for some reason, still a touchy subject for some, but Engels makes the case that the state is not actually abolished; it withers away, and the reason this is the case is that you aren't going to a coercive force especially when you have minoritarian rule. So a minority using this coercive force against the majority of the population. And that doesn't really make sense for that to wither away, right? Because the only way for a minority to maintain their power and the way that status quo would be through coercive force. And if that just magically disappears one day, or like it slowly gets worse, they're not going to be a minority for very long. Like they're going to get overwhelmed and done away with in a revolution.
They're gonna look at a wall for some reason.
Right. And so
it's a very important thing to look at.
Right.
Yep.
And so the interesting Engels basically says, okay, well, the only reason it would wither away is if the majority of the population were using the coercive force of the state against a minority. In which case, and especially in our time, that minority is vanishingly small. I mean, seriously, like, we're talking about like the capital B bourgeois. There's really not that many.
3,000 people
really
in the U.S. if you're going to be like pretty specific.
There's like 5.5 people who rule like the whole country.
Exactly. Yeah, the capital B bourgeois is a very, very small percentage of any given population. I mean, personally, I think like the petty bourgeois is actually kind of maybe would be a bigger issue in terms of like who would the proletarian state be oppressing and preventing from being counter-revolutionary. It's probably petty bourgeois, if I had to guess. Basically, your average run-of-the-mill fascist.
Yeah, but the thing is, you may think like that. You don't abolish private property immediately. Instead, you abolish private property, or more like nationalize the property of the capitalists. So when the national, not the petty bourgeois, see that their property isn't vanished, and the property of the larger and more well-versed capital owner was vanished, they won't be more as a counter-revolutionary in this sense.
I hope that's the case. They would see.
No, it is the case because we did it.
I mean, if they're being reasonable, that would, yes, I think that would make sense. It would be futile, basically, to resist against like 95% of the population or something.
And you would have to shoot some people here and there. It is not that big of a deal. Let's continue.
Yeah.
For the liberal in the wall, I am kidding. I swear to God.
Well, it's also a good point that like from when, well, certainly since when Engels was writing and Marx obviously, but also even from when Lenin was writing, the process of proletarianization across the whole globe has become quite advanced. I mean, there are not as many peasants now as there once were. Especially like even people who own like small plots of land, like a very modest farm or something like that. Even those types of people
I'm gonna have to leave soon. Yeah. I'm gonna have to leave soon, but I will make a point first. I would make a point of looking at the Arab countries, especially Egypt and Iraq, because they are the countries who had like the vast history of socialism. You would see that the government supports the socialist government, gives money to the petty bourgeoisie, basically to lower their prices down, so the proletariat can buy the luxury goods or buy the necessities that the government is supporting, without the petty bourgeoisie going into counter-revolutionary trail of thought. And this is a very important thing to do, because when when the idea of a counter-revolution dies, it never comes up, basically. Or it never comes up in the near future, let's say, because now you have a new status quo, and what they want, what they would like to have is to keep the status quo. If this is the status quo, they will not revolt.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that sounds right.
I feel like that goes against history with the whole sweep of what happens to the Eastern Bloc. Like, as soon as the state let down the pressure just a little bit, all the reactionaries took power again.
They took power not by their own abilities, but they took power by the support of the CIA, basically. I would refer back to Iraq once again and say that the reactionaries who took power after the fall of Saddam Hussein didn't take power because they were able to or not, or didn't take power because they had a ideological counter-revolutionary force, but they took power because of the support of the CIA, basically. And this is the thing, like the state itself is a tool of class suppression, and what you would need to do is to suppress the bourgeoisie class and the petty bourgeoisie class. But when you suppress them too much, you would have a counter-revolution. When you don't suppress them, you would have a counter-revolution. You would need to get the perfect balance between a counter-revolution and a counter-revolution, basically.
Yeah, I think there's also the interests of the petty bourgeois and the capital B bourgeois are not totally aligned either, which is another interesting dimension to it.
Mhm.
Right, because you can have a counter revolution from the capital B bourgeois, and if you have a counter revolution from the petty bourgeois, it would be for slightly different ends. I mean, both
And
of
the
them are
thing
fundamentally
is that the
reactionary,
petty
but
bourgeoisie,
yeah.
yeah, but the thing is that the petty bourgeoisie have more in common with the proletariat. So the better good that we can have from socialism for like 10 years, let's say, would kill down a lot of the ideas, the reactionary ideas that they might have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, petty bourgeois can definitely be radicalized towards, like, being more sympathetic to the proletarian cause, but
Mhm.
it can be tricky.
Yeah.
Because I think,
As I told you, you have to find the balance between two counter revolutions.
yes, it's very difficult. Yeah, so let's go over Lenin's analysis of this really quickly.
I will leave now. Take care, people.
All right.
Enjoy your class.
Okay, so yeah.
All right, so Lenin summarizes very nicely here. So, so when you have a proletarian revolution, they're going to have to abolish the bourgeois state. However, after the proletarian revolution, and now there's a proletarian state that has been basically rebuilt from the ground up. That is when the state begins to wither away. So it's only beginning to wither away after proletarian revolution. So definitely kind of a big takeaway from the first chapter here. So I don't know if we want to go through these one by one or anything. I don't think we have to. These are mostly just kind of summary stuff. But if any of these jump out to somebody, we can talk about it. Or if you just have a totally separate question, that's fine. Any big lingering questions on chapter 1? Kind of talking about what the state is, what it looks like, and going over Engels. stuff. Too big. Next.
Judging by the silence, I think we're good to move on to chapter 2.
Yep, next we got some history lessons. 1848 to 51. All right. Now we have a lot more marks in here. And actually this is, I believe, from the manifesto, this first one we read last week. And actually AMX kind of touched on this just a second ago, that the proletariat doesn't just like seize all the capital, all the means of production overnight, right? This is just not how it's going to happen. This it's going to happen by degrees, but eventually they're going to have to centralize all of those in the hands of the state. And then he specifies, right, the proletariat organized as the ruling class. So again, indicating that there's a distinct characteristic to the proletarian state, or it is a unique manifestation of the state. It's not just taking over the bourgeois state as is, not changing anything. Oh, we're in charge now. And then, yeah, Lenin is sort of responding to this and elaborating a little bit. The culmination of class struggle under capitalism ought to end with the political rule of the proletariat. So this is basically the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And instead of being backed by special bodies of armed men, it is now basically the general armed force of the people. So yeah, this is basically like a people's army, that sort of deal. Slide right. Okay. All right. Next, we're still talking about revolution stuff. So, this is basically what Marx is suggesting is going to happen here. So, he's talking about. Sorry, this is a little more history. So, talking about what existing parliamentary republics have done is that every time there's a revolution, no matter how small or no matter how successful, they tend to increase their repressive measures, right? I think, and I know at least in America, this is on full display because in 2020 we had the widespread like Black Lives Matters protests all over the place, and how does Joe Biden respond? We need to increase police funding all over the place. That's, it would seem ludicrous, I think, from a liberal perspective, right? Oh, this doesn't make any sense. How could this possibly be the case? How could they possibly receive that message from genuinely, like, I would say, if not, obviously, I'm not going to say that the protests were in any way organized, but I think he generally had some revolutionary fervor in there, at least. And how does the government respond? Tremendous increases to police funding across the board, right? Which, again, sure, if you are a liberal, you're losing your mind. But it should make total sense if we're being real, right? If we're being actually materialist about it, of course they would. Of course they're going to increase their repressive measures. They're going to further increase government power. And, he's pointing to the fact that previous revolutionary movements, while good, have unfortunately only perfected that machine of oppression. And that's usually because a lot of those either were not aiming to smash the state machine, or they just didn't get there, right? They didn't totally finish the project. And then, yeah, Lenin kind of basically summarizes the same points here. He's also mentioning here this era of imperialism, right? And that, especially in Lenin's time, even more than when Marx is writing, is that this is basically even more true, right? There's a pretty intense, there is an intensification of repressive measures, anywhere from the monarchical countries that still existed, even up to freest republican countries, which I think is hinting at essentially America and or the UK or something like that. So yeah, just kind of reiterating the same point. Reaching this conclusion that the ready-made state machinery has to be smashed. That should be like the proletariat's primary objective for a revolution. Alrighty. So, we got Marx here summarizing arguably Marxism in, for lack of a better term. Yeah, so he's talking about the historical phases in the development of productions. This is sort of historical materialism. And I left the part out where he basically mentions, right, that, Marx is saying, well, I didn't really come up with classes necessarily, or even class struggle, but he put a lot of that into perspective, in historical perspective, and how this has led to a development of production over time. Right, so class struggle isn't just like one thing that happens here and there, and it's just a cute little phenomenon. Like, no, this is, it goes all the way to the bottom here. And then he also, obviously, class struggle leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that this dictatorship will eventually lead to the abolition of all classes, aka communism. So,
communism.
That's right. And there's a really interesting bit of wordplay from Lenin here, which is lovely, that these currently existing states, bourgeois states, capitalist countries, aka, they could easily be, under this framing, they could easily be called the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Right? So, I guess I'll just kind of go over this quickly, the use of the word dictatorship, right? That essentially just means it's an organization where either one person or one group calls the shots for the rest. But when you say dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, that clearly means that the bourgeoisie is calling all the shots for everyone else. Now, like we just mentioned, bourgeoisie is an incredibly small group of people in any given country, and indeed the entire planet. They're like the capital B bourgeoisie, not that many people. So it is pretty close to, I guess you might say, like the more colloquial or liberal definition of dictatorship, which is like what, one person doing everything themselves, basically, which is rarely the case. Even in like the most autocratic regimes, obviously there's not one person doing everything. It's always going to be institutions, lots of officials, blah blah blah. But yeah. Anyways, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is basically an oligarchy. That's pretty close to what it is. On the other hand, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, what is the proletariat? It's the working class. That's a lot of people. It is a ton of people. So it's literally in the billions. So how could billions of people dictate anything, right? Well, clearly that would have to be through democratic means. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but it's basically an inevitable conclusion. So if anyone, here's you say, oh, dictatorship of the proletariat, that would be sick. Be super based. And they get scared. spooked out because they hear dictatorship and they go, "Oh my God, you're a tanky." It's like, well, how do you think a couple of billion people would like make decisions? I mean, for real.
Mhm.
So, anyways, that's kind of just again, that phrase is made probably perfect sense, I'm sure, when it was written, but since been heavily distorted. Unfortunately,
attempting to modernize it is democracy has some level in it, but for everyone is usually functional. Though you can always exclude the current ownership class. Dictatorship does suffer from serious word policing issues.
yeah, it does.
Yeah, it's like authoritarian, like big scary word that is used to describe autocratic regimes. So it's kind of treated as like a naughty word. I don't know.
Oh yeah,
Like,
It seems more distractionary than anything else. The whole,
mhm.
oh no, the spooky word is being used. These people must want to install a strongman leadership organization instead of the, we want everybody to freaking participate. It's in their interest and ours.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Don't worry, we will. Lenin actually quotes from Engels at length from on authoritarianism, so we will definitely get the. By the way, we probably should have just included that as supplemental reading because it's actually pretty short on authoritarianism. So if anyone hasn't read that, check it out. It's like maybe 2 pages.
Don't you mean on authority?
Yeah, whatever. I guess on authority. Yeah, that one. Yeah, I'll put the main, like the final paragraph. I have the final paragraph from that text in this PowerPoint because it's in State and Rev. But yeah, it's a short text. Everyone should check it out when they get a chance. Yeah, because it just gets so exhausting, right? About the whole like, oh, you're an authoritarian. Well, motherfucker, yeah. Like
Yeah.
every government that's ever existed was authoritarian. Anyways, um, so anyways, yeah, Lenin again. Just a nice summary here. Like I said, a lot of what Lenin is doing in this book is almost like a big fat literature review, taking a lot of these Marx and Engels quotes and really boiling them down into a tightly packaged, well, package, I guess, but with a lot of very consistent terminology, which is right. He's introducing like dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, dictatorship of the proletariat. I don't know if he does it in this. No, I think it is later in this text where it's at the end of the text where he does. He kind of distinguishes between lower and higher stage communism and sort of nicknames lower stage communism as socialism. So again, he sort of was like streamlining a lot of the terminology here that Marx and Engels were either a little loosey goosey with, or if not loosey goosey, then the terms had sort of had already taken on reformist and revisionist meanings since they were written by Marx and Engels. Lenin's kind of coming in and saying, "All right, let's not get carried away here. let's make sure everyone's on the same page from the original source." Okay, so again, just mostly summarizing. So, any major questions from chapter 2? All right, let's keep moving. All right, next, the Paris Commune. This is an important chapter. So again, Marx and Engels, really both of them, made an addendum to the manifesto after the events of the Paris Commune, and they basically made the only edit they think that they did make, which is mentioning that essentially they're saying, we have a data point now, right? That the Commune was the first people's revolution in Marx's own terminology here, and that from that experience and like learning from it, even though it was ultimately a failure, a lot of stuff was learned. And again, this is where we're getting into a really, really good example of like the science in the scientific socialism, right? Right. If you want to think of like, oh, what is Marxism? Well, I would say it really is like the scientific study of like a revolution, and specifically proletarian revolution. And the ones doing the studying are the proletariat themselves, and then revolutionaries within that. So, it is literally like a social science, and you need data points to learn anything in science. So the Commune was this really important data point that luckily Marx was alive to witness and write about quite a bit, actually. One of the big takeaways is that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purpose. Yeah, it just didn't work. And they kind of go over why that didn't work. So, first of all, Lenin points out that the reason Marx calls it the first real people's revolution, right? So, in other words, like this wasn't a revolution that was serving the interest of a small minority, like a small group of the population. It was really at least aimed at serving the majority, which includes both the proletariat and the peasantry. That's an important distinction, right? That's why we have the hammer and the sickle. They're both, you really do need both of those humongous populations, really classes, in order to even be called the people. And indeed, Lenin points out here they are united in that they're both oppressed by the state machinery, right? And so smashing up that machine is really in their interest. And indeed, he even goes a little further and says this is actually the precondition for a free alliance of the peasantry and the proletarians. So, there is this sort of contradiction or just separation between town and country. Pretty sure anyone in any country can probably attest to this fact. And that, that does create some tension and some slightly opposing interests. Whereas, while they do have opposing interests in some cases, they really do need each other to survive. Right? Like proletarians in the cities, primarily in the cities. I know there's more spread out, but if you're in a city, right, you're going to need like food to survive. That's going to require some sort of peasantry out in the fields, growing that food and bringing it into the cities. And then, the peasantry needs proletarians to produce stuff, the necessities of life, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, they have some differences in some cases, but they really do need each other. And that the best case scenario for that alliance working out is, and again, Lenin goes so far as to call it a precondition, is to really smash the state machinery. That's why we have the hammer and sickle. If you're wondering. Not just a hammer. All right, so the next logical question you might be thinking, well, what are we replacing the state machinery with? Seems like an important question to ask. So, right, we already kind of addressed the business of suppressing to crush any that resistance and counter-revolution. But the difference here, again, kind of already went over this a little bit, is that now that suppression is wielded by the majority of the population, which will be categorically different from all previous formations of the state. And it says, well, since the majority of the people are suppressing its oppressors, eventually that's not going to be necessary any longer. The special force for special is no necessary. Again, it's not an overnight thing. This is gradual. But once the majority of the people are in power, and they are a mostly armed population, there's not much the bourgeois can do about it, realistically, without just like mass destruction. So yeah, there's a little bit more into this chapter. Obviously, this is again kind of ties back into the state kind of. All right, next. So got Marx talking about the issues with parliamentarianism, and I think this is an indictment, especially of the common. I think probably the most common form of basically bourgeois democracy, which is, oh boy, we get to pick our oppressor for a couple of years. Who's gonna oppress us? What a fun decision to make every once in a while. And that should be something worth mentioning to your local liberal who tells you to like just vote. Duh, maybe to give them a gentle reminder that at the end of the day you're really just picking your oppressor, which is also why it's, when you frame it as like the least of two evils or whatever, yeah, kind of. I mean, yeah, that is pretty much what you're picking. Not much of a choice. So that's sort of what he's talking about there. And Lenin does clarify, right, that when we don't want parliamentarianism, but we're not trying to get rid of elections. That would be quite self-defeating. What we want is some sort of working body as our government. So this is where you get into the things with like, the legislators, or I mean, they really aren't even like legislators necessarily, but whoever is in these governmental positions, they're making like working stiff wages pretty much. I know Lenin talks about that as one of the other things that was important from the experience of the Commune, and that this is something they did right, and basically the people in the Commune who are elected to any whatever position, they were just paid basically an average salary, like whatever the average working person made. That's pretty much what the average government employee made. So first of all, there's not like this discrepancy of income, so that's a minor point, but an important one. But again, this is the Commune is supposed to be a working body, as opposed to basically, I think he calls it like a talking shop or talk shop, where they're just hemming and hawing and bickering and all this crap. I mean, again, I'm sure I know one thing in America that's been very obnoxious recently is the whole January 6th committee shit. It's so fucking dumb, complete spectacle, total waste of time. I think the Democrats even like hired like Hollywood filmmakers and stuff to like help them with the presentation of it. I mean, it's so transparently spectacle that does absolutely nothing for average working people. It's like so transparent, and yet so many goddamn liberals are just frothing at the mouth, like, oh my god, did you see that this one dude, blah blah. It's like, dude, who the hell cares? What the heck are you talking about?
Fixation on the spectacle. It is fixation on the spectacle. You don't want the people actually seeing what's going on behind the screen.
Yeah.
And doing so would usually make them rather angry and likely to light things on fire.
Yeah, and this is actually an interesting point too. That a lot of the observations that Lenin makes in this text, I would argue, have only gotten like more egregious with time. I don't know to what degree they existed in his time. Obviously, enough that he observed these sort of phenomenon and wrote about them as like failures of parliamentary and bourgeois democracy, democratic republics, etc. There's plenty of criticism of those forms in this text, but I feel like those criticisms are like 10 times more valid to the in the modern day. Like they're even more egregious nowadays.
Well, there really hasn't been any changes, major game-breaking, game-changing, dang it, game changers for American democracy from the 20th century to the 21st century. It's the same system that's just been patched a little here, patched a little there, but it's the same system that's been run by the genocidal founding fathers to make sure their own ilk has stayed in power, and it's just been running consistently since the 1700s till the 21st century.
That's fair. Not much has changed.
I believe I mentioned this. Apologies. I believe I had mentioned this during the last book club meeting I was in, but it boils down to the aristocracy's name has changed. What they are hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Let's get to the next one here. Hopefully we'll get through this in a all right, yeah. So again, they're making an interesting distinction here. And that when we talk about the ready-made state machinery, we're mostly talking about the merely repressive organs. That if there are any legitimate functions, they can be restored when you actually have once they're under proletarian control. And I'm sure for any given government, you could probably find certain functions within them that are, perfectly reasonable to keep around, even if there is a change. And so, like, a change of leadership is totally acceptable. Like, I'll just kind of throw out one innocuous example. In the U.S., the National Weather Service. It's part of NOAA. They collect weather data from all over the country and centralize that data, basically process it, and send it out into the public domain for free. If you've ever watched a weather channel, your local weather station, looked it up on your phone, all of that data comes from the National Weather Service. All of it. They literally take that data, put it into whatever fancy schmancy graphics they have, and sell it to you. They're literally taking a socialized good that is completely free and then selling it to your local station or whatever. So, but it's an example of a public service that's incredibly reasonable to keep around. Why would we destroy the National Weather Service? Well, we wouldn't, obviously. That'd be foolish. So yeah, there's plenty of examples in every government of legitimate functions that just help society hum along. I think the Postal Service is also a great example in almost any country. Not to say there aren't any flaws in any given postal service, but you will need a postal service, right? That is still going to be something good to keep around. And like I said, it might be dysfunctional, underfunded, blah, blah, blah. That can be addressed. Obviously, there's systemic issues like that, but we wouldn't say, let's smash the post office. Like, no, that's not what we're talking about, because the post office really doesn't repress anybody. it's generally agreed to be a public service that everyone. Indeed, I think we should expand pretty much every national postal service and have all the private services clogging it all up. So, anyways, yeah. So the Lenin's talking to here, kind of the same idea, and I think what he's mostly responding to with this paragraph is probably his criticism. I'm sure he got from who knows, but basically criticism maybe from anarchists. I can see them maybe getting prickly at this point, but people who might be worried about this centralism, right? Democratic centralism specifically. Yeah, so he's basically saying, well, people are gonna obviously organize into their own he's actually walking through their argument for them, I think is what this is saying. So he's saying, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that the proletarians and the peasants just sort of form commune spontaneously, and they all realize they're going to have to unite to crush capitalist resistance and seize their capital. And then once they, in this process of transferring capital away from capitalists and to the public domain, so to speak, or he says onto the entire nation, he's like, isn't that kind of the same thing as centralism? Like, what's the difference? He's like, you might be prickly. Oh no, centralism, like, isn't that just another state? He's like, well, no, because the entire point of dismantling private property and making it publicly owned property, collectively controlled. What's the difference between that and democratic centralism? It's the same freaking thing. And I mean, personally, at least from a lot of anarchist theory I've read, it's not that much different from, either ML or just general like communist theory. Pretty close to the same exact thing. They just get prickly at certain terminology. And again, I think if there was a little more really just sort of bridging the gap, like if sort of read both sides of the argument, they'd realize they're really going after almost identical goals, except when you give it a name like democratic centralism, they get prickly and say, no, that's just a state. We can't do that. It's like, well, I don't know how to help you then.
There's no escaping a centralized bureaucracy, especially if you're dealing with anything of scale. You're still going to need somebody to make sure that water works, the trash gets taken out, and basic logistics are taken care of.
Yeah. I think, if you want to get like real analytical about it, it's again sort of, I would argue, this issue of very idealized conceptions of these things versus how they will materially manifest. They're gonna manifest as essentially what looks like it's gonna look like a government that essentially just helps the economy chug along. That's pretty much what it's gonna be. And so if you have this idealized conception of just state bad always, right? Well, let's be a little more realistic, basically. That's at least.
Yeah, that's the whole thing Engels was going on about in authority, where it's talking about the inevitability of some hierarchy, and then it gets brought up the times anarchists try to have their revolutions, like in Bakunin's at work. Engels brings out how anarchists just kind of got dragged along by their bourgeoisie. Then they went off and formed their own juntas and the Spanish cantons. Then they didn't form their they didn't collectively form a resistance against the Spanish state, and they all got smashed down one by one. Then there was that one final city that started going around attacking other former former anarchist cities just to support themselves. It's just like a whole clusterfuck.
Yeah, there is a book about that. I believe it's an Orwell piece called Remembering Catalonia.
What?
Which
No.
was
That was the. I'm talking about Bakunin's at work is 18 and it's 19th century. George Orwell's Remembering Catalonia is from the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and it's a propaganda piece for the capitalists, anyways.
always worth crapping on that one. Good fun times.
Well, he just painted a whole rosy picture about how the evil Stalinists came in. That's why the Spanish Republic lost. Nothing about how the CNT, how the Huasquis and the anarchists staged a mini coup against the Republican government and stuff.
Or how they ended up paving the way for Franco shortly thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed, I think there's even in the example of the Paris Commune, I think there was also like another example of anarchists like completely fumbling the bag, literally, because I think they had the opportunity to like seize the central bank in Paris or something like that, which would
the Paris
which would have
was
like completely thrown the army, like the French army, into shambles, because basically if all the soldiers realized, hey, wait a minute, all that money that you guys like pay us with is suddenly in the hands of the commune, so wait, why are we fighting for you when they've got all the money? The anarchists said, nope, we don't want money, we're just gonna not take it. And guess what, the army came in and killed them all. Like, come on, guys.
Yeah. Lenin will eventually hit into his favorite bitching at topic, the Mensheviks, shortly hereafter.
Yeah, get there. Unfortunately, I didn't really have the time to finish chapter 6. It's also obviously a lot of Lenin's criticism is interesting, very very good learning, but I think there's also better contemporary examples. Some of it can be kind of like, you just feel like Lenin is like old man that yells at clouds or whatever. So yeah, I didn't really tackle chapter 6. I think obviously read it on your own time, digest it, but I don't think it's worth spending a ton of time.
That's acceptable.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so again, Marx is saying, reiterating, this was like the commune was like really a working class government, and that this is basically kind of confirms that some sort of proletarian state, call it that, is key. And obviously the commune did not survive, a lot of reasons, but they were pretty dang close. And then I think this paragraph from Lenin is really great here. So he's criticizing first utopian socialists on the grounds that all they're basically trying to do is just if only we can conceptualize the ideal scenario for a socialist revolution, or like maybe the ideal form of a socialist society. If only we can just think hard enough, then we'll be good, right? If we can just think of the perfect idea, tell everyone about it, and everyone's going to go, oh, you know what? You're right. That sounds great. Let's just do that. Let's just be communists tomorrow. So that is like the definition of utopianism. He criticizes anarchists for just not even bothering with this task. He's like, you're not even trying to think of a political form. You just, again, it's almost like you're just scared of political forms because political form bad. So that's his criticism of anarchists. And then the opportunists are arguably the worst of the bunch because they're just saying, let's just use the political form we have right now. You know, the bourgeois democratic state. And that we can't, you know, threaten the establishment at all. You know, that is like, again, the most ludicrous one where, you know, he says battering their foreheads, praying before the model. So really driving home that this is just absolute like lunacy. So again, keeping the political form we have now, obviously not a good idea. Having no political form whatsoever, probably not a great idea. There's like a tiny possibility that works, but it's pretty improbable. And then utopians just thinking of some magic, perfect idea that will just snap everyone out of the capitalist ideology. Also kind of silly, not worth spending time on. So basically, this is all leading to the conclusion, how about we just start with smashing current political form and trying to come up with one that is as democratic as possible. So yeah, that's about getting rid of the parasite state, and certainly we don't want to keep it. Okie dokie. Any questions about the chapter on the Paris Commune? Pretty long chapter. A lot of good stuff on that. A lot of really cool history too.
I do have a question here. So this was in the Organization of National Unity section. He says national unity was not to be broken, but on the contrary, organized by the communal constitution. And I'm just trying to understand what differentiation Lenin makes between the nation and the state. Often they're kind of conflated. I'm just trying to understand Lenin's perspective there.
I think nation mostly just refers to like a large group of people that would be mostly geographic, if I had to guess. So this would be like, you know, the Russian, like just how there's the USSR, for example, right, which is the union of socialist Soviet republics, right? That's all of them. But within the union, you've got like you still have like a Russian Soviet, basically. There's a Ukraine Soviet, there's a like et cetera, right? There's a whole bunch of nations within the union of republics. So, and I mean, that's what they're, I think that's all he means, is basically starting with like your geographic region before, certainly before spreading, or you have to basically start with your local bourgeois where you really get anywhere. I think that's what he's referring to. That's my understanding of the difference between a nation and a state. Nation is more of like a group of people in a geographic region, whereas state is like really specifically a governmental form. Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
No, I think we're good.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to absolutely guarantee my answers are 100% correct. That's just my understanding of the distinction there. All right. Let's, if no questions, we'll keep it rolling. Yeah, supplementary stuff from Engels. I reduced this to one lovely slide here. things of importance. This is the stuff we get from On Authority, right? Absolutely heater. This is banger stuff here. But yeah, so actually a little bit from I think it's on housing Engels. So we'll start there real quick, or the housing question. So this is an awesome quote that I've also almost used verbatim when you get the classic liberal rebuttal of like, how could we possibly like house everyone? What a ridiculous question. Turns out even when freaking Engels was writing this stuff, there were more houses than there were homeless people, right? Houseless people. And you know, the answer to this problem is pretty damn obvious. Just take houses from the owners that don't use them. So this is landlords who are they're basically owning tons and tons of buildings that and for the pure reason of rent extraction, we're going to expropriate that shit and put people in there that absolutely need it. Or really, I mean, whoever's renting it can become the new caretakers of that property. And then indeed, now he's talking about like filling houses with homeless workers. But I think we know, at least in I know in the U.S. this is certainly the case. There are like way more houses than there are houseless people. It's good old fashioned market for you. So the answer to the housing question should be pretty easy, especially in the modern day. We should just be able to take it from them and put people in there that need it. Pretty easy answer. And if we really need extra housing, just fucking build it. Shouldn't be too big of a deal.
Yeah, I think I saw somewhere that in the US there's like 16 million vacant houses or something like that. So that's crazy.
Yeah, I think I've heard that number too. I think that number includes a lot of like derelict houses that probably wouldn't be safe.
Yeah.
Because there are a
Probably.
shit ton of abandoned homes around the country. A shit ton.
Yeah.
So I think that might include that. That big number might include this. But even then, even like brand new developments that went up within the last 10 years or so have like literally never seen a buyer. So yeah, there's lots of ludicrous situations like that. But yeah, Engels' solution is pretty much just fuck it, take their houses, because why not? And then the next paragraph, we have the lovely conclusion from On Authority. So in regards to anti-authoritarians, quote unquote, he says we can really conclude one of two things. Either they really don't know what they're talking about, because and the result of that is just pure confusion. It's the idealist fog that you get lost in, or they do know what they're talking about, in which case they're just wantonly betraying proletarian cause. They're just serving reaction, like knowingly. And if they're being knuckleheads who haven't even really even considered what authoritarianism is, just for even like 5 seconds, even then they're still serving reaction, because they're just leading people astray, really confusing people. It's such a simple problem, my goodness. It's not. I shouldn't even say it's a problem. It's not a problem. Yeah. Anyways, read On Authority. It's good. Short and sweet. Yeah, not too much there. I still have some questions, but because obviously there's a lot in that chapter, I didn't want to spend too long on it, because a lot of it is sort of Engels addressing some specific criticisms from other German social democrats and stuff. There's like anti-socialist law going on, some Menshevik party stuff. So again, it's good. It's all good content. Definitely read it at least once to get the gist. But I didn't want to spend too long on this chapter. Just trying to shorten the presentation slightly. This will probably not be as big of an issue once we start getting a little shorter readings. So I think we'll be working on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll keep rolling here, because I think the next chapter is also very good. So, the economic basis of the withering away of the state. Revisiting this problem, because it, again, like Lenin says this many times, that this is a very often distorted comment or just concept, right? The reformists and all that shit, the revisionists, whatever, they're constantly misinterpreting stuff to kind of fit the agenda. And yeah, so we're kind of getting into the nitty gritty here. So Marx presents this question as, okay, well, what transformation will the state undergo in communist society? Or, puts it the other way, what social functions will remain in existence that there are analogous to present state functions? So I'll put it in my own words, right? Okay, so we've gotten to the point where we said, all right, we're going to smash the bourgeois state, scrap pretty much all of the political apparatus and the repressive structures, chuck that stuff away. So that's like police, courts, judicial system, legislative system, executive system, pretty much that kind of shit. Scrap that garbage. And we're going to have to rebuild a brand new one that is built by the proletariat, for the proletariat. So yeah, we're going to go over that a little bit now. They talking about. So, let's see, what was this quote about? Oh, I guess, yeah, I mostly put in this just because it's a little bit of Lenin injecting a little bit of the, again, like dialectical materialism in here. I think like theory of development, that's pretty much a reference to dialectical materialism, I think. And so yeah, he's just commenting on the question, I suppose. So we'll get into the answer, right? All right, so the Marx is talking about okay, there's this transition from capitalist communist society. What does that actually look like? So first of all, it's a political transition. So this is referring to kind of the state apparatus, and the general form of that state is going to be the dictatorship. Awesome. Now, Lenin comes in and gives some extra detail here, basically elaborating. So he says, big difference here. When you have democracy for an insignificant minority, that is the democracy. That's a democracy for the rich. That's the democracy we have right now. And I didn't have. Actually, let me see if I can find this other quote, because it's also one of my favorites. I didn't put it in the slide, but the quote where it says, freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics. Freedom for the slave owner. That's another, pretty much saying the same thing, right? That when you hear right-wingers, conservatives, reactionaries, whatever, talk about, but my freedom, they're pretty much referring to this freedom for the slave owners, right? They can't even, and it's gotten to the point where they almost can't even comprehend the type of like freedom that they might actually experience under socialism. It's almost incomprehensible, which is kind of interesting, right? But it's a lot of ideology going to work there. But indeed, democracy for the vast majority of people, and which will include the suppression by force, including the exclusion from democracy of the bourgeois. This is the democracy we're talking about during the transition from capitalism to communism. So basically socialism. So we're talking about democracy under socialism. We're talking about democracy for essentially everyone in the true sense of the democratic process. So, and this is not just democracy on a political arena, right? So talking about like rights, blah blah blah, but really democracy also in the realm of production. So this is democracy basically across the board, pretty much everywhere it would possibly make sense. So again, first phase, communist society. This is AKA socialism. It's in sort of streamlines terminology here. So they're talking about the slight difference between first phase or lower phase or first phase and higher phase. So lower phase communism, aka socialism, Marx is basically putting it as from each according to their ability to each according to their contribution, right? So the way he puts that here is, equal performance of labor will get an equal share of the social consumption. So what you get for your work, the way you're compensated for your work, just is essentially proportional to the work you're doing. And I know there's a lot of like contemporary work on this sort of like what this formulation might actually look like. So there's like participatory economy and like participatory democracy. There's some interesting basically constructions around like this concept, right? Of like how will we determine what is an equal amount of work, right? So like how much does a programmer need to work in order to be equivalent to a construction worker? And there are ways that this can be decided upon democratically, so as to make sure this principle is met as closely as possible. And indeed, it's not perfect. I mean, Marx even says so, right? This is a defect. This is not perfect. We don't really want to settle here. And this is actually something that you can mention if anyone is like, well, what's the difference between socialism and communism? You can start with this difference, right? Like the difference between getting rewarded for work versus rewarded or just basically taking for need. And that is an interesting difference, but if you call yourself a socialist, that's totally fine. It's just that we don't want to end at socialism. Like that's not what we're trying to do here, because we have to acknowledge that construction is not perfect. And the reason we'd have to settle with that in the short term, like socialism short term, because that's basically what succeed capitalism. Lenin basically mentions something AMX just said earlier, which is that the abolition of capitalism is not an immediate thing. It's going to take some time, and we need to really create the economic conditions to get to higher stage communism. And indeed, during this whole process, and he brings up the state withering away, because the class distinctions are also disappearing. And once you get rid of capitalists, pretty much that should be the end of class, hopefully. And that really there's no need to suppress classes any longer once the proletariat are in charge. And then higher phase, communism. We have the classic formulation here, from each according to his ability to each according. So we're trying to get to this principle. And and actually another thing AMX brought up earlier, which is that, labor is no longer seen as simply a means of livelihood, but life's prime want. And again, just a quick distinction between work and labor, right? Work is sort of implied, especially in a capitalist context, to be working for someone else, generating surplus value for the realization of profit. That's what work is. It's got a almost universal negative connotation. Nobody really likes working, even if you're like, oh, I love my job. Well, you probably, that might be true, right? You might love what you do. You probably don't love that you're exploited for it, though. Like, I don't think anyone can answer that, honestly. And so, indeed, we want to reach that point where people are working, fulfilling jobs in society, societal roles that they believe should be filled, and that they want to do. And actually, I propose this as a question of the day, so hopefully we'll get posted. But something I think about a lot, and I think it is worth thinking about critically. Think to yourself, just whatever, like what are some either major societal projects or types of labor that you'd like to engage with in a socialist society? Like, there's so much work on this planet to be done to fix like an infinite number of problems, but those problems are almost never going to get addressed in a capitalist economy. In fact, I can pretty much guarantee there's a lot of problems that won't get addressed because they are maintained as problems to keep the economy running. So I think that's an interesting question to think about, right? Like, what are these major issues in the world that you see and you're like, man, I wish we could do something about that? I think it's worth thinking about. And there's a lot of good literature out there about how to fix these problems. Like, that's another thing I often tell people. They might say, oh man, climate change is such a difficult problem to fix. It's like, honestly, not really. The literature is pretty settled. The science is pretty solid. We have a lot of ways of fixing the problem. Except there's one gigantic fucking roadblock in the way, and that's capital. Obviously, it's a major block. But anyways, yeah, that is higher phase communism, which is, again, just given the nickname, just capital C. So yeah, that is end of that chapter. Pretty much the end of the PowerPoint, because all I have is this last slide. Work. Oh,
Kautsky!
It's supposed to be Lenin shooting a spitball at Kautsky, but that's okay. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got for the PowerPoint. So yeah, any thoughts, questions? I'm curious, is this anyone's like first exposure to Lenin?
Yeah, it's mine. It's mine.
Well, what'd you think?
I joined like 3/4 like of the way through, but like I agreed mostly with everything that was shown.
I did actually really like the whole book review aspect of it. It really did help to get a bunch of disparate points from various sources and bring them all together, and it was good exposure.
Yeah, I think this is really nice. Like I said, it almost reads to me as like a literature review. That's a lot of what it is. But Lenin's really great at synthesizing a lot of this stuff into like easily digestible content. And just like the mother bird, I'm basically chewing it up and vomiting it into each of your mouths. So it's even easier to digest.
Numb.
But yeah, I mean, I know for my own development, I remember reading Conquest of Bread and this book almost back to back. Because I was really undecided on this. Like, okay, seems like a split in the road here between what the anarchists are saying and what the MLs are saying. And I pretty knew it at this point. And I said, okay, I'm just going to read what both of them have to say with very little preconceived notion. And quite honestly, this text was way, way more compelling of an argument. I mean, just hands down, made a lot more fucking sense than Kropotkin had to say. And Conquest of Red is a good ass book too. I mean, I'm not going to totally disparage it. I just simply did not find the argument as compelling, or as didn't make as much sense. Because I think this book
Did
makes
have a question about
lot
that.
of fucking sense. Yeah, go ahead.
So in chapter 6, Lenin was saying how the best of the anarchists, of course, and not those who, following the Kropotkins and company, trail behind the bourgeoisie. How exactly? Why was he referring to Kropotkin in that way of trailing behind the bourgeoisie? I haven't. He's been on my reading list, but I haven't gotten to him yet.
Hold on, I'm trying to look for. Can you tell me what page that's on? I'm trying to find.
I'm reading an EPUB. Mine's on page 140. It's in.
Oh, okay, my PDF doesn't have 100 pages. So, which give me the section at least.
Yeah, let me see if I can find.
Like
it here.
chapter 6, there's like 1, 2. Actually, I might be able to search for.
Yeah, it's in the last section, so it's not too far until the chapter 7. Just sort of maybe if I just give a
Okay,
screenshot or something.
Yeah, I found it. I just had to search. Okay.
Ah.
Let's see. Okay, yeah. So I think he is criticizing Kropotkin there. Behind the, I'm not sure what he means by trailing behind the bourgeoisie. I can pretty much confirm
it seems
Kropotkin
like
is not a fan of the bourgeoisie, but indeed, I mean, Kropotkin was actually he's a big fan of Marx. I think he puts Marx and Darwin like on the same pedestal, essentially, in terms of like their contributions to science, essentially. So I'm not sure what he's criticizing, like what grounds he's criticizing it on exactly.
Earlier on, back in chapter 5, he also does talk about the Plekhanov conversion of the Kropotkins.
Hmm.
And again, I'm not familiar with Plekhanov aside from what was spoken of in this reading.
Yeah, I know he had a lot of issues with Plekhanov, but I don't remember him having any big issues with Kropotkin. Like they even had like a huge public funeral for Kropotkin after the revolution. So like he was clearly like a very well liked public figure. I mean, even Lenin literally was like, gave I think eulogized him. So I'm not sure what he's criticizing Kropotkin for specifically. And even as an, I would definitely categorize myself under ML as well. But even I think Kropotkin's got some stuff like Mutual Aid, really good, a really good book. Again, it helps to kind of deprogram a lot of those conceptions you might have picked up along the way about like human nature. Kropotkin does a lot of work to basically dispel that notion by analyzing that, throughout historical development, the way quote unquote human nature has manifested is radically different. Because, shocker, it's dependent on your material conditions. I don't think Kropotkin does the same. He doesn't analyze it the same way Marx does, which Marx would basically just say, well, this is dialectical materialism, of course. People's consciousness is determined by their environment and their material conditions, so on and so forth, and not the other way around. Kropotkin essentially argues the same exact thing, but almost more from an evolutionary and ecological perspective, which I think is really fascinating. So again, coming to the very similar conclusions, but just kind of. But yeah, like I said, this Conquest of Bread was sort of not as compelling. It almost feels like a lot of what he taught, like the model of an anarchist revolution he discusses, is almost too similar to the Paris Commune. And there's clearly there's like a lot of inspiration from that event in his writing, but it's also, I think it was written after. It's either Paris Commune or the check here. When was Conquest written? Yeah, okay, it was well after 1890. Yeah, I don't. It just sounded like, as long as the proletariat and the peasantry make sure everyone's like fed and housed, then everyone will just sort of like agree that we don't need a state, and everyone's hunky dory. A lot of the anarchist literature seems to focus on like, well, as long as we can demonstrate that we can meet people's needs without any sort of hierarchical organization, then people will just sort of understand that we don't need any of that. And yeah, that just is not how it works. There's got to be. It's actually also interesting because I think a lot of anarchists prior to the October Revolution were all about, like, they wouldn't even consider like self-defense. They wouldn't even consider it because it's too close to like an organized force, which is pretty much what a state is, right? So they're like, oh, even kind of organized self-defense would be too close to a state. I think after the October Revolution, a lot of the anarchists started changing their tune all of a sudden. Started saying, oh, well, self-defense is actually totally fine, right? Because you're fighting back against some sort of hierarchy or oppressive force. And again, it's pretty clear why. Because everyone was able to learn that, after the October Revolution, you had like a coalition force of Western imperialist armies come and try to fucking kill the Bolsheviks, which is, I know, rarely fucking taught in history classes. I remember learning that for the first time. It was kind of a shocker, because you think, oh, the U.S., England, and France, and a couple other countries like invaded the USSR. Like, what the fuck? But yeah, they did. And so the need for like basically a Red Army was immediately obvious. Yes, we need a people's army to defend the revolution. Otherwise, they're going to get stamped out by neighboring countries that haven't quite gotten there yet. You know, this idea that neighboring capitalist countries are just going to be like, yeah, they're good. We'll let them have an anarchist revolution. Just sit by and do nothing. I mean, that's just a ludicrous idea. That, like, as soon as I sort of realized that that's what they were getting at, I'm like, oh boy, I don't think I can be an anarchist. That just seems too ridiculous to me.
Can I make a quick comment?
Mm-hmm.
I think because someone asked about why Lenin was critiquing Kropotkin, and I'm not sure if this is the reason why or if it lines up exactly time-wise. But I do know that Lenin and Kropotkin had some disagreements over like the cooperative system, whereas Lenin sort of saw them as like maybe being able to be influenced or taken over by like former capitalists or former members of the bourgeoisie, whereas Kropotkin and the anarchists tended to be really in favor of cooperatives. So I don't know when that dispute came about and if it lines up with when the book was written, but that might be it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I might have been.
Thank you.
That brings to mind there's a whole point during the collectivization, Stalin's collectivization period, where there was this whole groups, big number of peasant organizations where peasant cooperatives and organizations, the local Soviets, where the kulaks were just in control of the Soviets and the organizations because they used their for existing wealth and privilege to take control and stymie the the central committee orders and prescriptions.
Yeah, that's actually something that I've thought about in terms of just thinking about the, again, in my context to be the American material conditions, but I don't think there is a real, like, huge peasantry any longer in America. It still exists in terms of just, like, again, peasantry is defined by its relations to the means of production, right? But like small scale farmers are really dwindling, which is interesting, right? And I think farmland, just farming as an industry, is being highly centralized in a few like massive conglomerates, like Monsanto is like a really big one, for example, right?
Tyson's.
Yeah, Tyson's. I mean, yeah, the livestock industry is super fucked up, and while I'm not a vegan myself, I would, gladly welcome an end to the at least the industrialized livestock industry. Really does need to go. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting. I don't know. I guess I'm trying to think, right? Because I think even like most small landowners, like they either, a lot of times they don't actually farm the land themselves. They'll also like contract it out to other like farmers, basically, who the farmers will bring their own equipment to other people's fields and harvest whatever crop it is, like, for them. And they'll basically just get a cut out of whatever, whatever money is made out of it.
Yeah, that's true. I have a family member that he came from Guatemala, and he like what's it called? He harvests the fields for the farmers, and he gets paid really, really little. It's like insane.
Yeah, I would maybe. I feel like the best argument that could be made for like a peasant class in the United States
It's
would
the
probably
immigrants.
be like migrant farm workers and like just like immigrants who just have to be paid under the table, stuff like that.
It's
Right.
immigrants especially who came from Latin American countries.
Yeah.
Yep. What's really, this is what's cool, right? That I think at least Marx's interpretation of the peasantry is that they have to be a peasant, like you do kind of own a small plot of land, and that you harvest it yourself. So there's like a little bit.
Yes.
But a migrant worker might even fall under something like a category of like lumpen proletariat, right? Where they are.
Yeah, I feel like
fundamentally.
Yeah,
they're like lumpen. They're lumpen, meaning in rags, but that's another way of saying like they have to operate outside of the law, because in the American context they're illegal immigrants, but we understand illegal just means nothing. They're just workers, basically.
Yeah, I feel like from like my perspective of like my parents were and still are like farm workers, it's definitely more like it's definitely lumpen, but it's more like a serfdom, sort of like you work for whatever farmer for that season, and they like give you a little room in a house, and you basically like pay off your debt with that.
This is literally my uncle. He farms the land of this farmer, and he lives in I think this little trailer with a bunch of other people.
Yeah,
and it's like, oh my god.
Well, that's just rural proletariat. Lenin wrote this pamphlet about the situation of peasantry in Russia, and that's one of the situations he was talking about. That the rural wage workers that just worked for rich farmers that could afford to pay and stuff.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Call it lumpen or not, whatever. I mean, they're basically just proletarians at the end of the day.
The work is all the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like in the United States context, specifically, like the sort of distinction that you have in a lot of past revolutions of the rural peasantry and the urban workers of minimize in a U.S. context, just like both because of modernization and also because like the majority of rural workers or the majority of people who live in rural places don't work in like agriculture. They just work like in whichever factory owns the town, basically.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of factory towns, and then a shit ton of land in between those. Like especially like I'm thinking of the Midwest, for example, right, where you just have like giant swaths of privately owned farmland, which is mostly automatized at this point.
Illinois. Yeah, I live in Illinois, and it's like, oh my god, I think like 90% of the whole state is just plains and like farms. It's kind of sad.
Yeah, I'm from California, but like not the lame parts. I'm from Central California, so it's pretty much the same. It's just like farms, land to set up.
Yeah, breadbasket of the world.
Yeah.
Fuck yeah. Yeah, I can also relate a lot to what's called the migrant workers, seeing as like my mom is a migrant herself from Guatemala, and yes, so like she's been struggling her whole life to like do anything. Like seeing her, I guess seeing her struggle is really radicalizing. I've been curious about stuff like Lenin. I got introduced to Marx like in history class, and so it's probably it's just seeing how like you can relate to the modern world, like how Marx basically predicted everything.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with that. Just like seeing these ideas that people and like these trends that people saw 100 years ago and still being able to see them play out now, and also to kind of adapt them to our own context. It's just really interesting.
Yeah, that never ceases to amaze me either. This stuff could have been written yesterday and it would still be so arguably even more relevant than it was when Lenin was writing. And certainly Marx and Engels.
Yeah.
I think I talked about this a little bit last week. Manifesto. When they were writing the manifesto in like 1847, I think the proletariat as a class, and especially how they defined it, was a pretty small percentage of the population. Most people were peasants, and the process, like proletarianization, was kind of just underway. Especially, and it was the most advanced in England, where Marx and Engels were hanging out. And so it was fascinating because they were analyzing like kind of the beginning. I mean, capitalism had existed longer before them, but it was still in its like early life cycle when they were analyzing it. And I think that's easy to lose sight of, but because you read this and it's like, well, of course, obviously, right? But no, it's not obvious that the entire world was becoming proletarian, especially to the degree it is now. Or yeah, what is it, like 10 people have the same wealth as like 4 billion? I mean, that's a level of inequality I don't even think Marx could have fathomed. Probably because he would have been like, "Why the fuck haven't you revolted yet? What the fuck are you waiting for?"
No, what's wrong with you people?
That's fair.
If I recall, the US has worse wealth inequality than France, like as monarchy, you know.
Yeah, it's more than France at the time, right?
I think so. Yeah.
At least that's what I've seen. Oh my god.
All right, well, before it gets too late for everyone, does anyone have any suggestions for the next reading? And we can always make a poll in the chat, and if there's like more than one that people want to read.
I'm kind of new to the chat, so I don't know what you guys have covered in the past.
Yeah,
but I think it might be nice, like if you guys haven't covered it already, maybe one of Engels is writing on like family or private property. That would be cool.
Yeah, that sounds cool.
Yeah, the origin.
Sure.
That book, so I've read a few chapters of that book a while ago, but I actually have read that there is a lot more like modern anthropological research since Engels wrote that, like well over 100 years of anthropological research and so some of Engels' conclusions in that are a bit outdated and like no longer supported by modern evidence. So there are some.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot. I wouldn't say a lot, but there's definitely some things in there that are outdated. So actually, I might see if I can find like a more modern take on that text, like an updated one where it has like similar analysis but with evidence. I think that would be fascinating. I know that actually I even mentioned this last week, I think, but it's like Sex, Class, and Race by Angela Davis.
By Angela Davis?
Yeah, she does a little bit of that in terms of like analyzing the more, like, I think what she wrote that was 70s or 80s, something like that. But it's a much more modern text, obviously, about 100 years updated. But she references that text a lot, and she does like a full blown Marxist analysis of, gender relations, race relations, class relations, and with including some like intersectional dimensions to that. So that is at least one text I can think of off the top of my head, which is kind of a more updated version of that text from Engels. But I'm sure there's probably plenty more that I'm not aware of. But yeah, that's a good one. I've definitely heard quite a few requests here and there for black shirts and reds.
Ooh, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's good.
That's a good one.
That is a very good one.
Definitely.
Yeah. I have read that.
How long is that one?
That is a good question.
I think
I
it's
know
like
it's a bit.
160 pages.
Yeah, it'd probably be at least minimum 2 meetings, maybe 3.
Yeah.
Let's check it out.
It's like 6+ hours for an audiobook version.
Okay, the PDF on Google is 186. What would you say the audiobook was? 6.5 hours?
6+ hours.
Okay, yeah, so that's definitely probably a couple chunks.
I think it's almost double State and Revolution.
Yeah, because I think maybe a good trajectory that we can plot out for the next few weeks. So if we do black shirts and reds, and then maybe into imperialism, because I think black shirts and reds would hopefully give a lot of contemporary evidence and obviously Parenti's breakdown of anti-communism versus actual existing socialism and stuff like that. Although a lot of it is basically like how awful imperialism is, essentially. Might be a good prelude to imperialism. Does that sound about right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm curious, about left communism. Infantile disorder. Would that be a good choice?
Yeah, that's another good one. But it requires a lot more historical context, which does provide some.
Another subject I would eventually like to get to, and one that I think is pretty foundational, would be dialectical materialism. It's something I've watched a few videos on it, but still would like to do some formal reading.
Yeah, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism.
Yeah, both of those I would love to get to. I do love me some dialectical.
Is it Mao who has pretty good introductory writings on dialectical materialism, or am I thinking of the wrong person?
Yeah, it's on practice and on contradictions, and he gives a lot of writings on dialectic materialism in general and on solving contradictions, and lots of his speeches and books and stuff.
Yep, I think there's also I have not read it, but I think it's Historical and Dialectical Materialism by Stalin, which is sort of like his synthesis of a lot of Lenin's stuff.
There's also a good PDF download that I saw that was about 130 pages long, called Materialism and the Dialectical Method.
Who's the author of that one?
I don't know, because I thought I was downloading dialectical and historical materials.
Okay. I'm looking up the one by Stalin. I'm seeing how long that is.
It's like 3 to 4 hours of an audiobook, I think.
This Marxist.org page is only like a few pages. Is that the whole thing?
Yeah, Marxist.org, they cut out a lot of Stalin's works.
Yeah,
you know,
a lot of his works tend to be abridged on there or not included.
yeah, well, it's run by a bunch of twats, so they.
Yeah, that would do it.
True.
Yeah, so there's another website called Marx to Mao, Marx to Mao, that has, I think, more of Stalin's works are uncut.
Okay.
This book I recommended is by Maurice Cornforth.
Relegate. Somewhere. Give me the PDF, please.
Yeah,
That's
so
how I sound when I see what textbooks I have to buy for the semester. I'm like, give me the PDF, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Stalin is barely 2 hours long.
Yeah, I was gonna say it
It's
looks fairly short.
But then, like I said, Marxist.org has got a hate grudge against Stalin, so best to verify it with other sites.
Okay, this looks correct. I think I found a PDF version. Looks pretty complete. It is 16 pages.
Pretty short.
Yeah, not terrible. Yeah, that's a pretty solid one for like a 1 week read. I think yeah, Black Shirts Reds will probably be like 3 chapters.
6 to 8 chapters.
9. So Black Shirts Reds 9 chapters. So we could maybe do like 223 or something. Or sorry, 2223. That'd be almost a month. Imperialism is also not super long, but would certainly be more than 1 week.
A lot of imperialism is like a lot of just straight up like
Numbers.
financial data and stuff. So that might shorten the amount of time that it would take to read it. Just because a lot of that is just like, oh yeah, they were making this much money in exports and imports and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, good point. Skip a lot. Let me check the reading lists that have been posted previously. Okay, we did. So, okay, what we've done so far is Principles of Communism, Manifesto, Wage, Labor, and Capital, Value, Price, and Profit, and State and Rev. I think that's basically all of them. we kind of just slapped on. I guess technically combat liberalism was kind of glued to the manifesto. Just it's literally like a couple paragraphs. It's super short, so we didn't really spend too much time on it. Looking at the list, Farhan posted here. So that has dialectical and historical materialism by Stalin. Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific is also pretty good from Engels. That's a little like historical materialism and a little bit of dialectical stuff. Black Shirts and Reds. Yeah, I mean, I think I would say those are maybe the three directions we can go is either Black Shirts and Reds for a little bit of like history, like a little more contemporary stuff, and kind of learning more about like general anti-communist and fascist trends and how awful America is. And then we have, and then we can maybe go. We can also stick with Lenin, keep going with imperialism, or we can get into a little more of the philosophy side, I guess we can call it, with the dialectical and historical materialism. So do we want to do, we can do a straw poll with everyone in the chat right now, I guess, if we want to do that. Or we can...
All right.
Is everyone okay if we do a poll there?
Sure.
Don't want too many options,
Yeah.
so... So stop the